Hello, my name's Louise Asprey and I am the lead for Oldham Sixth Form College EdTech Demonstrator School. In today's session we're going to be looking at the principles of online learning and how we can adjust our practices to help students learn at home. What we're going to be thinking about is what the evidence shows us are the best bets for us to use. You're going to need a pen and paper, so please can you have that ready? Pause the video now and collect everything that you need. So this is the question that we want to answer in this session. How can we adjust our practice to help students learn remotely? And the key word is adjust. We're not changing things completely. We're not doing anything that's completely new. It should be about taking what you already know is good practice and adapting this for an online or remote learning context. So we're going to think about what we already know in terms of our quality teaching strategies. We're going to think about the Education Endowment Foundation's rapid evidence assessment and their planning framework that accompanied that for online learning. And we're going to think about good quality teaching in an online context. So this is the Education Endowment Foundation's rapid evidence assessment that they conducted not long after lockdown, where they realised that teachers needed support on what the evidence showed made good practice. They would normally look at about 1,000 pieces of research, but in this case it was 60 because it had to be done quickly. And they came up with 5 recommendations. That teaching quality is more important than how lessons are delivered. And this is one of the key things that we're going to focus on in today's session. And what that means is we know what effective teaching is. We know that clear explanations, clear instructions, guided practice, good modelling, good feedback are all the key elements of good quality teaching and learning. What didn't matter is how lessons were delivered. So it didn't matter whether they were pre-recorded materials and written materials on something like Google Classroom or whether they were delivered live. So anything that was in the press at the time saying that schools were having lots of online lessons and other schools weren't, that didn't matter at all. So if what you were doing was pre-recorded things, you were doing the right things. Obviously, the second bullet point about access to technology, we know that that is important and we know that students suffered because of that and that it is incumbent on us to try and put things in place to help with a future situation on that. But that's not what we're going to focus on today. Peer interactions can provide motivation and improve learning outcomes, and that's very difficult in an online context, isn't it? But we can do things like have shared Google Docs and slides for them to work on so they collaborate on one piece of work together, or that we can have Google Meets with them in very small groups so that they can talk about a piece of work, or they can do that on a live chat on Google Chat. So there's lots of ways of doing that, and that allows them for some motivation. Supporting pupils to work independently was an absolute key in lockdown. We know that the students that struggled with lockdown more were those that didn't know how to learn on their own. They didn't have the strategies and the motivation to be able to do that. So we're going to focus quite a long bit of today's session on that. And we know that different approaches to remote learning suit different types of content and learner phases. So delivering to early years is very difficult in a remote context. Practical subjects in any phase found it very difficult as well because the pupils didn't necessarily have the equipment that they needed to do a practical activity. So what we do in one subject might necessarily not be the right thing for another subject. So we need to be mindful that things can be done differently for different subjects. So these are the 2 things that we're going to focus on today. Quality teaching is more important than how lessons are delivered, but I'm going to talk you through the how in terms of remote asynchronous lessons and remote synchronous lessons, and we can look at the differences between them. But we're going to also focus on the skills that we need pupils to have in order to be able to work independently when we are not there to hold their hand and support them and pick up the pieces and give them the strategies that they need. So if we focus on teaching quality being more important than how lessons are actually delivered, these are the key things. We need to ensure that we've got the elements of effective teaching. So good feedback, good questioning, good assessment so that we can understand what they know and what they don't know, how we can scaffold, how we remove that scaffolding. They are all the elements that we know make good teaching, okay? We need to have time for pupils to build on their prior learning and assess their understanding so that we're considering what they know, what we can maybe review in a lesson, and what we can assess them on. And then we've got the difference between synchronous and asynchronous teaching, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. So whatever we're planning in terms of remote learning in any kind of new situation, on local lockdowns or on these tiered structures where bubbles are having to go home and work from home, these are the things that we need to be thinking about. It doesn't necessarily have to be new content that we make ourselves. We might use Oak Academy, we might use Khan Academy, but we make sure that what we take from anything like YouTube, we quality assure first of all that it fits in with the key strands of teaching that we know make effective practice. So what I want you to do is pause the video now and read through the difference between asynchronous and synchronous learning. So now you've had the time to look at that. In essence, asynchronous learning means that there's a gap in communication, so that you might record a video and the pupils might watch it in their own time, at their own pace, and work at home in their own pace. Synchronous is live, and we can have immediate feedback with synchronous learning. Because a lot of our learning during lockdown will have been asynchronous, we need to think about ways that we can ensure that we are delivering the content effectively so that there's no misunderstandings and they're not going down a rabbit hole of wrong information because we've not explained things clearly. With live teaching, we still need to plan effectively to make sure we can deliver things in the right amount of time and that we are assessing them in the right kind of way and checking their understanding whilst they are not in the classroom with us, because that is still quite a challenge. So these are some kinds of asynchronous learning activities. So, for example, read and take notes. Did you do any of that in lockdown? Did you give them something to read and ask them to take notes on it? And how did you deliver that? So I want you to read through these examples and I want you to write down all the ones that you think you used, all these strategies. Which ones of them did you use whilst we were in lockdown? So pause the video now and just make a note of the ones that you used. So you might have actually used quite a lot of these. Most schools were using more asynchronous learning activities than they were synchronous learning activities. So it might be, for example, explore teacher curated resources, that you put assignments and resources and websites on your Google Classroom and you gave them instructions and that's what they accessed. So that's a kind of asynchronous activity. Engaging in an online discussion for asynchronous learning is when there's a time delay. So it might be on the Google Classroom stream where somebody posts a question, you might post a question and they post some answers, but they might do that an hour after you've posted the question, the next day, in the middle of the night. They were working at all kinds of times. Then we've got synchronous learning activities. So remember, they are the live ones where pupils are in front of us or they're working and collaborating on a shared document in real time. So if I just move my bubble, if I can, you'll be able to see that on the bottom right. Real-time feedback on work in progress so that you can see them working on a particular activity live as it happens. So think about the kinds of synchronous learning activities you did during lockdown. Were you doing live modelling, for example, where you were modelling your thinking processes or modelling an activity live? Were you giving guided practice? Were you getting them to collaborate on a Google slide or a Google Doc? So even though that wasn't face-to-face via a video camera, they can see each other working on a document. So pause the video now and write down the kinds of synchronous activities that you did. So you might actually find that you did fewer synchronous learning activities, and that's absolutely fine if you were doing asynchronous activities with your pupils. Remember, it's not the how, it's the quality of what you were delivering that's important. But we're going to think about good quality teaching in a remote learning context. What does this really look like? And the Education Endowment Foundation looked at their metacognition and self-regulation guidance report and took out some key elements of that in terms of how to structure a good online lesson, to keep things simple and routine for pupils and to keep things easy for you, that you've got a structure to follow. And that was activate, explain, practice, reflect and review. And as I said at the beginning, this is about adjusting our content. This is not about doing something completely new. So when I explain these, you'll think, well, I'm doing these already. I do this in my lessons, and that's great. But it's about being a bit more explicit about the way we're doing things with pupils. They've provided on their website, and this is on the Google site that I've made for you, this structure to help you so that you can look at how these things can be applied in an online and an offline context. So online is in green and offline is in purple, and they give you some examples. So it's worth having a read of that for some examples of how you can apply this. So first of all, we have activate, where we are activating that prior knowledge and connecting to prior learning. So in your normal lessons, you might give them a question. So at the beginning of this session, I posed a question for you about how we could adjust our practice. And this is what we're attempting to address all the way through this video. You might give them a pre-lesson quiz, where it might be something they do before they come to the lesson, and you can see that being done live and you can adjust any information that you're giving them as you're going through the lesson. You might want them to pre-watch a video before they attend some live content in your lesson. You might give them reminders, you might give them some key vocabulary that you want them to check before the lesson. You might just start the lesson with a quick fire quiz that's live and they can write answers down in the chat or put their hand up to answer them on a Google Meet. So we are used to these kinds of activities. Then we get on to the bread and butter of the lesson, the explain. And this is where we need to be succinct, we need to be clear, we need to make sure that when they are at home on their own, they understand exactly what it is we want them to do and they understand new content. A lot of schools during lockdown focused on recap and retrieval practice of content that pupils had already learned. And we can't afford to do that again. We have to be able to be in a position where we are delivering new learning. So think about making your message very, very clear. Teaching the strategies of learning and explaining why that is useful. So modelling to them how you might, for example, annotate a poem, and the struggles that you might have and the things that you have to remember you need to do while you're doing that. So we are teaching them metacognitive strategies so that they can reflect on their learning. Use a visualizer for modelling if you can, and do some live modelling so that you're not just giving them a good example on a PowerPoint, because they need to see how you cross things out, how you adjust things, how you puzzle over things as you're doing your modelling. And you can use visualizers and model not just live but through recording so that they can replay the videos and have a look at you and think about the strategies that you were using. And we can focus on worked examples and gradually remove the scaffolding for them. The next one is practice, and giving time to actually practice the strategy in your lesson and making sure that that time is embedded. So it might be a short 10-minute video that you say, at the end of this video, I want you to spend 15 minutes writing a paragraph. And then they upload that for you to see. Or they come back to the video after they've done it. So giving them pause points. So think about, during this video, I am often saying, pause the video now and spend some time doing this. Because what we often find with pupils, and I teach A-level, and I found this with my students over lockdown, that I would make a 20-minute video, they would watch the whole thing all the way through, forget what I'd asked them to do, and sometimes my answers were at the end. And what I needed to do was explicitly say to them, stop, practice, and come back to the video when you've done that. And that's teaching them a study strategy. And gradually you can remove that support over time. Then we have reflect, so tasks that they complete so that you can check their progress. So just pausing during a lesson to get them to pick out some key points based on what you've already covered, giving them a quiz. Use Google Forms to do that, so it marks them for you. It might be metacognitive strategies as well as the cognitive strategies I've just gone through. So metacognitive strategies, what went well, even better if in this lesson. Reflect on how things have gone. So what strategies can you give them to reflect? And reflect can occur at any point in the lesson. And then we have review. So to store information into the long-term memory, pupils need to rehearse and review and consolidate. So don't just set them a quiz at the end of a lesson and think, brilliant, they've got it all, they've learned everything I wanted them to in that lesson. Can they do that same quiz in 3 days' time and score as well? Can they remember it? Can you take things from a couple of weeks ago and bring it into that test? And can they remember that? Get them to do things like recreating mind maps. So perhaps you've come up with the perfect mind map in a lesson for some kind of revision, but you give them a branch of that with maybe a couple of keywords on it, and they've got to recreate the rest themselves. Or the same with a knowledge organiser if you use them. Blank out part of a knowledge organiser and say, fill that in on your own. What's missing from that knowledge organiser? Get them to retake quizzes. Don't think you've got to make new quizzes all the time. Get them to retake them to see if they've learnt any more. So they are all the key elements of good learning and good online learning as well. So thinking back to that question, what does this look like in practice in remote learning context? What I want you to do is think about, are you using these strategies now in your face-to-face, in classroom, in the building lessons? So are you using activate, explain, practice, reflect and review? If you need to rewind this video to refresh what that means, then do so. But pause the video now and jot some notes down about how you think you're currently doing this in your lessons at the moment and whether there's any elements missed out. So this is a lesson plan example for an online lesson, and this is how I might start to plan. I'd start to think about, how do we do these things? So first of all, how do we set ourselves up for a good lesson? And I will always have a banner slide with clear expectations. So at the beginning of this video, you had a banner slide with the title, the question we were going to consider, and it said, please have a pen and paper ready for the tasks. So I might say to the students, make sure your phones are switched off, you're giving the lesson your full attention, you've got pen and paper ready, and that will just be a series of icons and a series of instructions before they start, so they can stop the video, they can run and get everything they need, and they come back. Then I think about activating their prior learning and giving them some tasks to do, and then I think, how do I now deliver new content? So I think about how I'm going to chunk that down, giving pause points for them to practice something or reflect on something. I do some modelling, and I then move on to how I might get them to do some more deliberate practice and try and think about doing that through collaboration. So again, I will model how to collaborate. So I'd show them how to use a shared Google Doc so they can write on things together, or a Padlet or a Jamboard, and I'd give them the opportunity. So I'd model how I'm going to annotate a poem. And in first person, I will say, I need to think about making sure I know what a metaphor really means. I perhaps need to look up that definition because I struggle between similes and metaphors, and I need to look up that before I then find them. And I've found one here, and this is the connection to the poem. This is how I think it connects to the theme, and I talk through in first person like that in my modelling, so that when they come to do some collaborative practice, they are thinking in the same kind of way. And then at the end, I want to do something about checking for understanding. So that might be that I give them a quiz, I ask them to upload a photo of their work, something like that. So I might say to them, stop the video, do 10 minutes of annotating the poem that's on page 5 of your booklet, and upload that onto Google Classroom at the end of the lesson so I can have a look at it. So that's my accountability loop. That's me trying to make them accountable for a piece of work, and I can see what it is that they've done. And it might be that I get them to reflect on how they've performed in that lesson and what they could do differently next time. So that's how I might put that structure into practice. So the other recommendation that came out of the rapid evidence review was supporting pupils to work independently, and that can help improve learning outcomes. So this is taken from the Metacognition and Self-Regulated Learning Guidance report that the Education Endowment Foundation produced. You've got the poster summary there. You can't quite see it, but it is available to you. It's got 7 recommendations. And recommendation 6 is that we have to explicitly teach pupils how to effectively manage their learning independently, because they are not independent learners. They don't have the strategies unless we teach them how to do this. And it's our responsibility to do that in every subject. So it shouldn't just sit aside in a tutorial session. It needs to be done in every session. So I want you to think about why this is important. So pause the video now and have a read of those 4 bullet points. So guided practice is really important, and then removing the scaffolding as pupils get used to it. And with independent practice, we have to be able to teach them those skills. And that will be both generative learning skills and metacognitive self-regulation skills. So we might want to teach them how to take notes, how to read and highlight and pick out key information, how to imagine, how to practice, how to reflect on their learning. We're teaching them all of these activities throughout our lessons. And it's really important that we do this now, so that if we go into some kind of higher tier lockdown scenario, that they can have these skills now and go into that situation in a much stronger position than when we went into lockdown in March and it was an emergency situation. So in order to do that, we need to understand what metacognition is, and I'm going to take you through very briefly what it is, and I'll give you some extra resources to do some reading on that if you have the time. So metacognition is very high impact for very low cost, and the evidence is extensive. This the guidance report is based on about 1,500 pieces of research and a meta-analysis of that. So we know it's secure. That's what the 4 padlocks mean. And it has an impact of +7 months if we do it properly. And the impact is greater for disadvantaged students who don't or often have these skills because they are not taught self-regulation whilst they're at home. So it can have a big impact on disadvantaged learners. And this is the Education Endowment Foundation's definition of metacognition: an ability to use your prior knowledge to plan a strategy, to take steps to problem solve, to reflect on and evaluate, but more importantly, that we modify our approach. So that's the definition of metacognition. So I want you to think about, in your current context, how are you currently ensuring that pupils use the most effective learning strategies when they're not in your classroom? So what are you doing to teach them these strategies so that they can cope with homework and cope with a lockdown situation and manage their learning at home? But think about it in a homework context and a revision context if you want to. So pause the video now and write some notes down that address that question. So as we go through the next bit, you might find some strategies that actually build on what you're doing now. So the guidance report also talks about explicitly teaching metacognitive strategies to pupils, including planning, monitoring and evaluating their own learning. And I think as teachers, I know I am good at planning. I can help them plan their time. I can help them plan an essay. I am good at evaluating how they use their time, getting them to do that, evaluating how good an essay was and what they can do better next time. And what I often miss is that monitoring. So that point where I get them to stop and reflect, am I answering the question? Am I using the key terminology that I'm supposed to be using? Am I using the right strategy? Because quite often we get to the end of a piece of work and they've made loads of mistakes and it's all been a bit of a waste of time because they've not monitored and they've not stopped and they've not readjusted. So we need to think about building in planning, monitoring and evaluation. Recommendation 3 is about doing that through modelling your thinking explicitly to help them. So that when you're doing live modelling, you're speaking in the first person before you ask them any questions at all. So that you're saying, I'm going to do it like this, and I know I have a problem doing it in this way, so I need to think about, and you're modelling that process through with them. And the important thing is to think about both metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. So the regulation is how we plan, monitor and evaluate, and the knowledge is what we know about a task that we've been given, what we know about the strategies that we can use, and what we know about ourselves and the way we approach things. Do we find it easy? Do we know we find it hard? How have we approached it before? So think about any task that you do and how you might kind of talk in your head about how you're going to do it. And that might be how you're going to cook dinner. You know how to do it, you know what the ingredients, you know the strategies, you know how that you maybe struggle to make gravy and you hate doing it, you hate the pressure of cooking for lots of people. And you plan and monitor how you're cooking as you're going along, and you evaluate, are they eating at the end of it? And we do that as adults all the time, but we don't always give our pupils those skills explicitly, and we need to explicitly tell them how to do these things. So I want you to write down the names of 8 learners in any of your classes, a whole range of learners. Just write down 8 names. So pause the video before you have a look at the next bit of this slide and write down your 8 names. So now you've done that, we're going to think about 4 levels of metacognitive learner. So again, I want you to think about the pupils that you've just written down and think about where you're going to place them on this spectrum of metacognitive learner. And be careful, because sometimes the temptation is to think that our high-level learners are the best reflective learners, and actually they're not always. Sometimes our very academically able students are the ones that go to pieces under pressure. They get upset when they get things wrong. So they are not actually reflective metacognitive learners. They might be strategic, they might have the right skills, but they can't reflect and do things differently. And sometimes what we would consider our average students are actually more reflective learners because they've learned through failure. So pause the video, read the explanations and think about those 8 students. Where would you place them in that grid? And then think about how are you going to get them from one quadrant to another. So we're not going to go from tacit to reflective immediately, but how can you get a tacit learner to be more aware of their learning? How can you get an aware learner to be more strategic and a strategic to be more reflective? So pause the video now, read the information, place your students on that quadrant and think about what do you need to do to make them better reflective metacognitive learners. So now you've done that, these are some of the ways that we can manage, help pupils to manage their learning independently. So giving them some guided practice, modelling effective study and revision strategies. So not doing that kind of, for tomorrow I want you to revise for the test. Tell them how you want them to revise. Plan the time, plan the conditions for learning, help them to do that in their home learning environments as well. Think about metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive strategies and explicitly teach those alongside generative learning skills as well. So how to take notes, how to be imaginative, how to plan an essay, those kind of skills that we would normally teach as part of our academic teaching. And then think about all of that in an online learning context. One of the things I noticed in remote learning that it hadn't dawned on me was that during my face-to-face lessons in a classroom, I am still bearing that metacognitive load. So I am reading the room and reading their faces to know who's struggling and where I need to step in and give support. And when they're at home, they haven't got me to do that. So how can we teach them some of these skills to get them to do that for themselves? So think about metacognition in the context of remote learning, because if we can teach them these skills now, they will be in a better position for any local lockdown or any learning from home because their bubble has had to self-isolate. And it's important we do that now. So even simple things like making sure that there's a piece of homework set that's on Google Classroom so that they practice how to use Google Classroom and they practice how to manage their time at home. So when learners are being metacognitive, this is the behaviour that we will see. We'll see them drawing on their prior learning, using their experiences, preparing for things to be difficult, looking at similar challenges. So even looking back to lockdown, how did I cope with it in lockdown and how am I going to do the same things that worked? How am I going to do things that are different? So in a new and novel situation, they don't panic and they've got strategies to draw on to support themselves. And metacognitive learners will accept feedback from their peers and feedback from you without getting upset about it. So in terms of the things to think about now, over the next few lessons, think about a metacognition checklist. How am I going to encourage my pupils to monitor their learning? So what am I going to do in my lesson to make them monitor? Not plan, not evaluate, but monitor, because that's often the bit that's missing. How can I create opportunities for them to practice? How can I give them time for self-reflection? And does my classroom environment support metacognitive practices, or do I need to do more of this to help them be self-regulating in their learning? And again, notice that I've used those in first person because it's about you using your own voice in these questions as you would want the pupils to use their own voice when you're using questions with them. So I'm not saying to you, how are you going to encourage your pupils? You are thinking, how am I going to encourage my pupils? And you have ownership of those questions. So that's a strategy to use with your pupils to give them ownership of those questions in their own voice. So pause the video now, actually when I've explained this. These are the things that we've gone through today. What are your next steps going to be, given everything you've heard and everything you've read? And there are some additional resources on the site that you can have a read of as well. Think about this from an individual point of view and think about it from a faculty point of view, a curriculum point of view. How are you going to work together to do this? What is it that's important at the moment? And just pick one thing that you're going to work on, not 4 or 5, just pick one and do that one thing really well for a week. So you might pick an asynchronous learning activity. You might decide you're going to make a 10-minute video that they're going to watch at home, and you're going to model how to use Google Classroom effectively at home, and then that's the thing that you're going to focus on for the rest of the week. So that's the end of the video. Feel free to go back and have a look at some of the strategies that I've talked about. And if you could fill out the evaluation, that would help me plan for other training that we might want to do for you. And I can liaise with your senior leadership team, and it will give me some feedback on how I might do this video better in future. So thanks very much for listening. I do hope I get to meet you all in person at some point. Take care.